So Sebastian is an assistant professor at Humboldt University. And before he was at Humboldt University, he did a professorship. What's it called? Vertretungsprofessur. Replacement.
Visiting lecturer or something like that.
Visiting professorship at Rice University in the US. And he's written a book which is published with De Gruyter on Leibniz metaphysics of modality. And he's got an essay, is Leibniz principle of identity of indiscernibles necessary or contingent, in a Philosophers imprint, and another one forthcoming in Ergo on Spinoza and the essences of singular things, among other very interesting publications. And today he will talk about Ann Conway, and his talk is entitled, "Is Ann Conway a Monist?" And so I'm really excited to hear this talk today. And we've got a handout, and you can find the handout if you click on the link in the chat and then scroll down a little bit, and you can see you'll be directed to Sebastian's homepage. And once you click the link, you'll find a handout, talk Paderborn today or something like that in the files.
Well, thanks so much, Clara, for having me, and thanks for the really nice introduction. It's lovely to speak at this occasion. It's also really quite lovely to see so many familiar faces. It's really good to see you all. I'm going to talk about Ann Conway today, and the question I want to address is in the title. Is Ann Conway a monist? And just to be a bit more precise, and I'm going to be even more precise later on, but just to be a bit more precise now, here's another slightly different version of the question. Does Conway think that there's just one created substance, or are there several created substances? So for those of you who are familiar with Conway, let's see that adds a little bit of precision at least. In other words, is Conway's position about the created world, just about the created world, forget about God and that stuff, about the created world, is it a bit like Spinoza's? So is there just one substance and everything else is a mode? Or is it rather different from Spinoza's view? So that's what I want to talk about. And if you take a peek at my handout, you might already figured out what my claim is, because it says claim there pretty much on the top of the handout. And the claim is that Conway is not a monist, contrary to what many people have thought, actually quite recently. It's a kind of a hot debate at the moment. Now, put like that, that's perhaps just a little bit too bold, to be honest, because really I'm only going to argue that Conway is not a substance monist about the created world. So she does hold that there's a plurality of created substances, so she is a pluralist in this sense. She may be a monist in some weaker sense, though. So perhaps she is what some people call a priority monist in some sense. That will be introduced, the terminology will be introduced later in due course. But keep that in mind, that maybe if you just read it like that, Conway is not a monist, maybe it's a little strong, it sounds a little stronger than what I actually intend. Anyways, here's the structure of what's going to happen in the next 40 minutes or so. The talk has 4 sections. The first section is entitled Conway's Metaphysical Framework, and I'm just going to say a few words about the basics of Conway's ontology. And that's important for getting the question right. The second question introduces different versions of monism and also pluralism. And that's also important for getting the question right, because if you ask whether or not Conway is a monist, well, you want to be clear on what actually a monist is. Then the third section, an impasse, is about basically two different sets of texts from Conway's principles, which seem to contradict each other. Or at the very least, there seems to be some sort of tension in the text. And there are some more monist sounding passages there, and there are some more pluralist sounding passages. So we seem to be confronted with a sort of interpretive dilemma. And then section 4, Conway's pluralism, resolves this dilemma. It's the apparent dilemma. You can only resolve apparent dilemmas, I guess. And I'm going to argue that Conway is actually a substance pluralist, or at least that this is a more plausible reading, the overall more plausible reading of all these texts. And that created individuals are not just modes, but substances in their own right. So before I start, just a few words about the general strategy. It's roughly this. That's also on the handout. I think that's just kind of the bird's perspective spiel for the talk. I think that all the passages which prima facie suggest a rather monist interpretation are in fact compatible with the pluralist reading. And many of the pluralist sounding passages, on the other hand, are rather difficult to reconcile with a monist reading. So that's good for me because that favors a pluralist reading. And so I conclude that for all, the pluralist reading is a better interpretive fit. Okay, so that's the whole thing in a nutshell. And now I'm going to become a little bit more precise. I'm going to start with a few words on Conway's general metaphysical framework. So her ontology is a little bit peculiar and really super interesting, but I'll be rather brief and only mention the most important things which matter for what's going on later. So for Conway, there are 3 types of beings, or she often uses the term species. So there are 3 species of beings: God, Christ, and creatures. So that there's God is maybe not so surprising, and that there are creatures also not so surprising. We are talking about an author in the 17th century after all. What is a little weird is that Christ plays such a prominent role. And it's also not strange that he thinks that there is Christ. That's also standard, but that Christ plays such a special metaphysical role. That's of course a little unusual. Now the differences between these 3 kinds of beings, or these 3 species of beings, is spelled out in terms of mutability or changeability. So God is eternal and immutable. That's the first category. Then Christ is partly mutable and partly not. And that's because Christ can only become better, but Christ cannot get worse. Creatures, finally, are fully mutable. So they can increase and decrease in perfection. They can become better, but they also can become worse. Just to illustrate that a bit, I put on a few quotes on the handout. So quote A, these quotes are all from Conway's principles, I should say. So quote A says, there are 3 kinds of being. That's what I just said. The first is altogether immutable. The second can only change toward the good. So that which is good by its very nature can become better. The third kind is that which, although it was good by its very nature, is nevertheless able to change from good to good, as well as from good to evil. So here you have the mutability in both directions. Now, what's the relation between these 3 types of beings, these 3 types of entities? It is, and now we can see that Conway stands in the Neoplatonic tradition. It's one of emanation. That becomes clear in many places. I just picked an especially clear one. That's quote B. There she says, God is the infinite fountain and ocean of goodness, charity, and bounty. In what way is it possible for that fountain not to flow perpetually and to send forth living waters? For will not that ocean overflow in its perpetual emanation and continual flux for the production of creatures? Well, these are claims. These are grammatically questions, but these are claims. Now, what is emanation? That's a little hard to explain without using those very same metaphors, like the flowing over metaphor. But well, I'm going to try. So here's a rough understanding, which seems to capture roughly what Conway has in mind. So if a thing A emanates being to a thing B, then A produces B out of itself, out of its own nature. And during this process, the thing A, the emanating thing, doesn't lose any of its being. So it seems that emanation is asymmetrical, irreflexive, and probably it's also transitive. Also, the thing which does the emanating is these frameworks usually thought to be somehow more perfect than the things which result from the emanation process. So cutting off a piece of something, that's not emanation. That's just putting something into parts. That's different. Okay, so that was just my really super rough explanation, my attempt to explain what emanation amounts to. So why Christ? The rough idea, which is really prominent in the principles also in other contexts, is probably something like that. There needs to be a mediator between God and creatures because God and creatures are so dissimilar. So the reasoning, this kind of reasoning you find in quote C, but as I said, it's also prominent in other places. And there Conway says this: as proof of this, namely the existence of Christ as mediator, the following things must be considered. First, the nature or essence of God, the highest being. Second, the nature and essence of the creatures, which are so unlike each other that the nature of this mediator will become immediately apparent to us. That's a pretty brief argument, but the idea seems to be something like that, that God and creatures are simply too dissimilar to stand in a direct relation of emanation. So there must be something in between. Not exactly sure how to fully reconstruct the argument or whether it's a great argument or not, but since that's not my topic, let's just accept it. And let's accept the whole tripartite ontology as a given. So to sum up, Conway thinks there are three types of being: God, Christ, and creatures. And God emanates being to creatures through Christ. So that's the rough picture. The good thing is that you can basically forget about a lot of that because we are really going to focus on the creature side, so on the third type of being. Almost everything I'm going to say from now on is about that. And there's a hint to our question already in the basic setup of the ontology. So God and Christ are always mentioned in the singular by Conway, which makes complete sense. I mean, there aren't several gods, they're just one, and there presumably also aren't several Christs. There's just one. The third type, though, is typically put in the plural. Now you may wonder, does that mean that there are several created substances? Or is there, strictly speaking, just one created substance and still several creatures which are kind of in that created one substance? So that's something you may legitimately wonder about. I mean, you cannot really tell on the basis of what I told you so far, but you can ask the question already. Okay, so to get a better handle on that question, let's turn to section 2, monism and pluralism. So now all sorts of philosophical views are characterized as monist, and as it also sounds kind of cool if you call yourself a monist. So let's try to introduce some useful distinctions though, so that we know what we're talking about. So let's start and I put these types on the handout, at least most of them. So let's start with what I've called here type monism. So that's just the view that there's only one kind or one type of being, which is a really common view. I mean, there are all sorts of different versions of it, but it's pretty widespread. Just to pick a random example is look at materialism, like in Hobbes. I'm going to stick to 17th century examples. And the materialist claims that everything there is material. Hobbes even says that God is material. Of course, it doesn't mean that numerically there is just one material object. There are tables, there are apples, there are mountains and planets and minds are material too for the materialist, and so on. And the materialist only says that all those things are of the same type. They are material things, period. Descartes' dualism is dualist in exactly this sense, in this type sense. Descartes does, of course, not say that there are only two things, numerically speaking. Well, with respect to extension, some people say that, but let's ignore that. What Descartes claims is that there are two types or two kinds of things: thinking minds and extended bodies. Again, God is ignored. We usually call it a dualist, not a trialist, even though God is a substance too. Okay, so is Conway a monist in this sense, in this type sense? Now, if one looks at her metaphysics as a whole, the answer is clearly no. Because we just learned there are types. There are three types of things, not one. And these three types differ in their nature or essence. So that's pretty easy. If you only consider the created world, though, Conway definitely is a type monist. That's easy too. There aren't any categorical or essential differences between the different creatures. All created things are of the same kind, even though they appear to be quite different sometimes. But that's just appearance. They really all share the same nature or the same essence. Okay, so that's type monism. But type monism is probably not what one typically has in mind when one labels a philosopher a monist. Instead, one probably has in mind a form of token monism. So that's a numerical claim, the claim that for some entity, there's only one of it, numerically understood. And the first version I want to look at very briefly is what Jonathan Schaffer calls existence monism, which is the claim that there's exactly one object. Maybe sounds like a bit bizarre, surprising, but it's probably endorsed by some people. I think the philosopher who comes to mind most is presumably Parmenides. He is, I mean, I'm not a Parmenides scholar, but he might be a proponent of such. Whatever Parmenides' views are, I think it's pretty clear that Conway is not an existence monist. And I think no one claims that she is. She clearly holds that there are several created things. There are creatures, plural. So even if you leave aside God and Christ, Conway certainly thinks that there is a plurality of things. Okay, so let's take the next position, priority monism. And now things are getting interesting. So that's the view that there's only one fundamental object. But the priority monist allows for plurality or even an infinity of non-fundamental derivative objects, which are metaphysically posterior to the one fundamental object. Schaffer is such a priority monist. And such a, this view is actually pretty common in the history of philosophy, even though it's maybe not so fashionable today. But it's pretty easy to come up with a couple of names. So Spinoza is most likely one of them. Hegel maybe is, Bradley, and well, I already mentioned Schaffer. They all endorse some version of priority monism. Now, in contrast to these token monists, period. That's priority monism. I'm going to say a little more about that in a minute, but now I just briefly want to also introduce pluralism. So in contrast to those token monist positions, existence monism and priority monism, there's of course good old pluralism. So on the typical pluralist view, there are several fundamental objects. So think of Aristotelian substances, or maybe of Leibniz. These are typical pluralists. So a typical pluralist holds that there's a large number of substances, each of which is a fundamental being. Descartes is a pluralist in this sense. And well, of course, pluralism in this sense is compatible with type monism. So Leibniz or Hobbes think there's only one type of substance, but I think there are really quite a few of them. So, okay, these are the different versions of monism. I'm going to introduce some more subdistinctions in a minute. But it seems that what's really important for us is priority monism. So to better illustrate what a priority monist position looks in the 17th century and what people are probably thinking of, let's have a brief look at Spinoza's substance monism. And I put on just a couple of really famous quotes on the handout, which are from the first part of the Ethics. I'm very quickly going to read them. So that's 1P14, except God, no substance can be or be conceived. Okay, then 1P15, whatever is in God and nothing can be or be conceived without God. That's really important. And the proof for that proposition, not sure how helpful this is, but I put it on here too. Spinoza says, except for God, there neither is nor can be conceived any substance that is thing that is in itself and can be conceived through itself, but modes can neither be nor be conceived without substance. So they can be in the divine nature alone and can be conceived through it alone. But except for substance and modes, there's nothing. Let's just buy that. Therefore, everything is in God and nothing can be or be conceived without God. So the picture, which is probably familiar to most of you, is that there's exactly one substance, and that's identified with God or nature. But of course, there are other things as well in Spinoza's ontology. They are modes, and they are in the substance. So they are something like states of the substance or states the substance is in. But no matter if you have views on that, it doesn't matter for our purposes. So no matter what the relation between the spinocistic substance and spinocistic modes is, the substance is clearly metaphysically prior to the modes. So for Spinoza, there's one fundamental thing, the substance, and there are many, in fact, infinitely many non-fundamental dependent things, the modes. And now here's a maybe better version of my overall question. Does Conway hold a similar view with respect to the created world? Again, forget about God and Christ, just creatures. So is there just one created substance for Conway? And are you and me and my iPad and the moon just modes of this one substance? Or is Conway a substance pluralist? And does she think that there are several created substances? So this is my question. Towards the end of the talk, I'm actually gonna say a little bit more about a slightly different question that you might also be interested in. But now maybe let's focus just on that. Okay. Okay, now the trouble starts, an impasse. So the main problem is that Conway is ambiguous when it comes to answering the question I just asked. Because in different passages in the Principles, she seems to say conflicting things about the ontological status of created individuals. And it's this tension or this problem which has recently triggered a bunch of papers, basically. And a really interesting discussion emerged over just the last 5 years or so. So here, we now need to really look at those passages. So I'm going to start with the pluralist sounding passages. I found three, well, I found more, but I put three of them on the handout, G, H, and I. I'm going to quickly read them just so that you get an idea of what these passages sound like. So here's the first one. And so we see how a certain thing, while always remaining the same substance, can change marvelously in respect to its mode of being, so that a holy and blessed spirit or an angel of light may become an evil and cursed spirit of darkness through its own willful actions. Okay, forget about the angel stuff. It's clear that Conway here talks about a substance and presumably created substance, which can change marvelously. So, and then she says it can become better, and it also can become worse, can become evil, and even the cursed spirit of darkness. So that suggests that it must be in the creature category, in the third category, because it can become worse. Okay, so that's G. Here's another one, that's H on the handout. Here one may observe a kind of divine spirituality or subtlety in every emotion and in every action of life, which no created substance or body is capable of, namely through intimate presence. As shown above, no created substance is capable of this, and yet every motion and action whatsoever is. For motion or action is not a certain matter or substance, but rather a mode of being. Again, she seems to talk about a single created substance here. So same thing, and presumably there are several of these. So same thing as in the passage before. And then that's actually this quote I is from the same paragraph a little later. She says, motion and action are nothing but modes of created substances, plural, like strength, power, and force, through which motion and action can be magnified beyond what the substance itself can do. So in all those texts, Conway just seems to presuppose that there is a plurality of created substances. So if you read just those texts, it probably wouldn't occur to you that Conway might be considered a monist. Okay, but there's also that other set of passages, which I come to now, where Conway seems to say something quite different. So there are a couple. I'm going to skip a few, but I put all of them on the handout, so you have them. You can read them all. So I'm going to read K. I'm going to skip J, but I'm going to read K. All creatures or the whole of creation are also a single species in substance or essence, although it includes many individuals gathered into subordinate species and distinguished from each other modally, but not substantially or essentially. At least prima facie, that sounds kind of monist. Then I'm going to skip L2. I'm going to return to some of these passages later, though. Here's M. She says, there exists a general unity of all creatures, one with another, such that no one can be separated from his fellow creatures. Okay, if you're so inclined, that might suggest a monism as well. And the strongest one is, no, sorry, I'm going to read N and O. So let's start with N. and as in whatever way bodies or spirits may be divided or separated from each other throughout the universe, they always remain united in this separation, since the whole creation is always just one substance or entity, and there's no vacuum in it. That sounds even more monist. You may have noticed that each passage sounds a little more monist in this series of passages. So it's increasingly monist. And the most monist sounding one is O. And there she says, God planted a certain universal sympathy and mutual love into his creatures so that they are all members of one body and all, so to speak, brothers, for whom there's one common father, namely God in Christ, or the Word incarnate. And now here's the most important sense. There's also one mother, that unique substance or entity from which all things have come forth and of which they are the real parts and members. Again, that sounds pretty monist. And it's passages like these ones which have led commentators to ascribe a substance monist view to Conway, which is not surprising if you read them. There are several examples I just wanted to illustrate a little bit, so you have a sense of what people say in the literature on this. So here's Krista Mercer, and it's called P. She says the created world, she says about Conway, the created world is one big, infinitely complex, vital substance whose various modes constitute individual creatures. That's pretty close to a Spinozistic view, I would say. And Emily Thomas, in a really quite recent paper, she defends the thesis that Conway is a priority monist. So she uses this framework as well, Scheffer's framework. And the following remark makes clear that Thomas thinks that this amounts to saying that there's only one created substance. So that's called Q. On the priority monism reading, the seemingly conflicting passages are reconciled by arguing that Conway is a priority monist. Okay. In answering how many created substances are there, there's no need for Conway to oscillate between the perspectives of God and creatures. There's simply one created substance and it is prior to its many parts. So just one created substance. Again, that's clearly a monist interpretation. Okay, now my question is this right? Does Conway indeed see the entire creation as one substance and created individuals as nothing but modes? Or are there several created substances? And why does Conway seem to fluctuate between monism and pluralism? It's really weird. I mean, whatever your pick is in the end of what Conway's views are, you got to explain away something. I mean, something must be addressed in these texts, because there does seem to be a prima facie tension. You got to deal with that somehow. And in general, I think that the pluralist sounding passages from the beginning, they need to be taken a little more seriously. I think there's a tendency among commentators to attribute some sort of monism to Conway. And I think these commentators might have trouble with the pluralist sounding passages, because how can a substance monist interpretation explain away those passages? That's a question I think that needs to be addressed. And I'm now gonna turn to my solution of the whole thing. That section for Conway's pluralism. Okay, you should now really feel the tension. So if you think it's completely irresolvable, that's a great thing. Now, to solve the interpretive problem I just set up, the apparent impasse, I think it helps out to separate out a few crucial but separate questions. So I think there are at least three, and for clarity's sake, I put them on the top of page 4 of the handout. So first question, does Conway think that creatures are modes, like Mercer and Thomas claim? And I mean, if that's so, then Conway's position would indeed be pretty similar to Spinoza's substance monism. I mean, of course, there are still God and Christ, and that's of course totally different. But on the creature level, if you just take that out and compare it with Spinoza's views, then it's becoming pretty similar. I mean, there's one substance and there are modes inherent in the substance. Okay, it's gonna be that's more tricky. To answer this question is more tricky than one might think. Then second question, why does Conway sometimes hesitate to classify created individuals as substances? I mean, as you already know that I'm a pluralist when it comes to Conway. But I still need to answer. I need to answer this question in particular. So why is Conway so hesitant? Sometimes, at least in some contexts, in all those monist sounding passages, she does not call created individuals substances. So why is that? That's I think also an important question. And third question: why does Conway sometimes classify created individuals as substances? That also needs to be answered. So ideally, an interpretation can also answer all of those questions. Now let's start with the first question. Does Conway really call created individuals modes? And if so, that would indicate a sort of spinicism, as I said. So the thing is that Conway never says that. She never explicitly says that created individuals are modes. What she does say is that created individuals are modally distinct from one another, like in quote K, for example. That's the one I read, but also the quote before that and after that, she says something very similar. But this modal distinctness talk, that can be understood in a variety of ways. I think what Conway probably means there is something relatively simple. I think she just means that two distinct created beings are not different in kind. They do not differ essentially, but only with respect to their modes. These things only differ with respect to their modes. It's just like if you imagine Descartes. Just like when Descartes says that two different thinking substances differ modally, he could say that, or differ with respect to their modes. They are minds. I mean, they're thinking substances. They're not going to differ with respect to their attribute or with respect to their essence, because essentially they are the same. They are thinking things. They only differ modally. So I don't think that talk that created individuals are modally distinct from one another suggests a kind of substance monism. I think it's totally compatible with a picture on which there are many created substances, maybe infinitely many created substances, whose essence is all the same. So they share an essence, but they are distinct from one another because they have different modes. They have a different modal profile, if you want to say so. And I think quote K can be read that way, and also quotes J and L. These are the ones I didn't read out. I think they can be understood along the same lines. Okay, now even though that's partial answer of the first question. Now, even though Conway does not explicitly call created individuals modes, you might say, she does sometimes or often hesitate to call them substances. Not always though, she sometimes says it, but often she doesn't. So why is that? Why is she using the plural substances for created things so rarely? My guess is that she is sometimes uncomfortable with calling created things substances, because oftentimes in the 17th century, especially, substances are understood as metaphysically independent entities. Think of Descartes, but maybe even more extreme cases are Leibniz, like these windowless monads, or Spinoza. And Conway makes clear over and over again that she sees all created individuals as intimately related with one another, and even as kind of metaphysically interdependent. So maybe this is why she is kind of cautious with using the term substance and attributing substancehood to the created things. Just to illustrate that, there's quote R on the handout, where she expresses this universal interdependence of all creatures. She says, moreover, the consideration of the infinite divisibility of everything into always smaller parts, it's not an inane or useless theory, but of the very greatest use for understanding the causes and reasons of things, and for understanding how all creatures, from the highest to the lowest, are inseparably united one to another by their subtler mediating parts, which come between them and which are emanations from one creature to another, through which they can act upon one another at the greatest distance. So there's a sort of emanation even at the kind of horizontal level between created substances, which is really odd. Anyways, I think it becomes clear in this and many, many other passages that there's a very strong interdependence of all created things. And maybe this explains why Conway sometimes hesitates to call created individuals substances. But sometimes she does, after all. We have seen these pluralist sounding passages. So how is this reconcilable with the substance monist reading? I think it's not. And I think Conway uses substances in the plural for really good reason, because her created individuals do display several features which are traditionally associated with substancehood, which are not traditionally not at all ascribed to modes. Importantly, she thinks that individual creatures, have the following three features. I put that on the handout. It's at the very end on page 4. So one thing is that created individuals are subjects of predication. That's pretty substance-like. Modes are typically not thought to be subjects of predication. Quotes I and J illustrate that. And created individuals are also persisting subjects of change. So that's also something that's traditionally associated with substances, but not with modes. Modes are not like that. Modes disappear. They don't persist. If there's a change, then the mode kind of goes away. That's really important for Conway, because she thinks that nothing ever dies and nothing is ever annihilated. Everything lives forever. And so these are really persisting things. And that sounds pretty substantial too. And then third, they are also causally active, which is another feature that's typically associated with substance and not with modes. Modes are usually not thought to be the kinds of things that can cause something. Only substances are. Think of someone like Leibniz. He makes it very clear. And I think each one of these three features is in danger of being lost if created substances are unqualifiedly called modes. I think that's the problem. So modes are typically not thought to be subject to predication. They are not thought to persist through change, and they are not thought to be causally active. And only substances are the right sort of entity. Now, I'm happy to be a bit concessive. I mean, there is this metaphysical independence thing, and they are not especially metaphysically independent, the created individuals in Conway. But I mean, even that is understood in a great number of different ways. I mean, for Aristotle and Descartes, for instance, substances surely aren't completely independent of one another. I mean, think of the Aristotelian picture. I mean, substances causally interact, they are causally interdependent, and so on. Okay, that may be different in Spinoza and Leibniz, but I mean, Spinoza and Leibniz are pretty extreme guys when it comes to this kind of thing. The more common view is that substances are interrelated. Okay, whatever the details here, I think the fact that Conway sometimes uses the term substance or substances for her created there's good reason for that. Created individuals in Conway are substance-like in several respects. Perhaps they are mode-like too in some respects. In the metaphysically independent, they are not metaphysically independent in the way substances are sometimes taken to be. But that doesn't change the fact that they are substance-like in the other three respects. In fact, I think that might even partly explain the fluctuating. So I think that's an attractive feature of my interpretation, that I do admit that they are a little bit in between the created individuals, which does explain why Conway sometimes hesitates to call them substances, but sometimes it's just okay with it. So what's the upshot? I think the upshot is we should not read Conway as a substance monist, but as a substance pluralist. So we should take the pluralist sounding passages very seriously, because I think the other more monist sounding passages many of them can be explained in different ways. So when the question at the outset, at the very beginning, in the title, when that question was whether Conway is a substance monist, the answer is, I think, no. But I'm going to end with a concession here. I'm perfectly willing to admit that Conway may be a priority monist in some weaker sense. It could be that there's a fundamental created substance which is metaphysically prior to the other created substances. And in fact, I think passage O suggests something like that. I nonetheless believe that Conway is a substance pluralist. Thank you very much.